and welcome to this session on learning theories, behavioralism and Pavlov's classical conditioning. My name is Dr. Anita Priyadarshini and I am Associate Professor at the Staff Training and Research Institute of Distance Education, Indira Gandhi National Open University. The topic for this video is learning theories, behavioralism and Pavlov's classical conditioning. This session is a part of the MDE 412 course on instructional design, which is being offered by the Indira Gandhi National Open University. As you may be aware, the philosophy of education influences educational practices and in fact forms the foundation for the implementation of such practices. Philosophy justifies educational processes and the way in which educational systems develop and how they function. The goals, the aims, the objectives, the outcomes, the methods are based on philosophy. You will also appreciate that philosophy leads to discourse, which enriches the thinking. Discourse leads to debate and rethinking and helps to bring about new thoughts as well as changes in the system. Educational philosophy leads to the development of educational theories, and these theories form the basis for the development of a new discipline. The discipline of education and its growth is based upon the philosophies and theories of the area. When we speak of learning theories help us to better understand how learning takes place. How do individuals learn? Why do individuals learn differently? How does one student learn different from the other one? What causes barriers in the learning process? How can sound educational practices be developed? These are all questions and many more questions that are dealt with by scholars of educational psychology. In fact, educational psychologists study learning and learning context, and hence learning theories have a major impact on the design of curriculum, materials, teaching, evaluation and many other practices related to education and its delivery. Some of the scholars whose work has had a major impact upon educational psychology and whose work has led to the development of major learning theories include B.F. Skinner, who in fact took forward the work of Ivan Pavlov and developed the theory of operant conditioning. You must have heard about the name of Leo Vygotsky and constructivism, which includes the concepts of scaffolding. In distance education, we use advanced organizers, which have been developed by David Ausubel. The hierarchy of needs is again brought forward by Abraham Maslow. Another scholar, Albert Bandura, is related to the social learning theory. All of us have heard the name of Benjamin Bloom, who created the taxonomy of instructional objectives, and other scholars like Bruner, Dewey, Robert Thorndike, Carl Rogers and so many more who have contributed to educational psychology. In this session, we will take up one of the major learning theories, which is that of the behaviorist school of thought. Here we will discuss the classical conditioning developed by Pavlov. The major learning outcomes of today's session are as follows. After the completion of this video session, it is expected that you will be able to explain the main features of behaviorist theory of learning, describe the process leading to the development of Pavlov's classical conditioning theory, discuss the major principles of Pavlov's classical conditioning theory, demonstrate the application of classical conditioning theory in designing instructional materials. So let us begin. What is behavioralism? Have you thought about the fact that every time you view a photo or a video on social media, you might like to press like, you might like to put an emoji to express your response. If you are walking in a crowded place and sometimes somebody calls out your name or calls out a name, you stop to check whether it is you who is being called. If you are traveling in a bus, you hear a notification blip and you look down to see whether it's from your phone. If you've ever been frightened or bitten by a dog or another animal, then there are chances that you might become scared, and even if a dog comes near you, you might step away, you might move away, you might step back. If you're at a concert and you're enjoying a performance, you respond by clapping, by smiling, by showing your appreciation. Sometimes when you hear a nice song, you immediately start smiling. These are responses that a person experiences which may be automatic, which come immediately, and a person begins to respond. Do try to take a moment and think of any such moment where you might have immediately and automatically given a response in your day-to-day life. It is a fact that each of us provides an automatic or a semi-automatic response when confronted with a stimulus. We respond, we react, we provide a quick, spontaneous reaction to a stimuli. According to the behaviorists, learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior. This change in behavior takes place in a desired direction due to the response that is given to a stimulus. Behavior is observable and measurable. There is an association between stimulus and response. A positive stimulus draws out a positive response, while a negative stimulus results in a negative response. For instance, as I said earlier, if you went to pat a dog and unfortunately the dog snapped back at you, then in future you may not like to go near a dog. If you analyze the situation, you will recognize that the dog snapping is a negative response, a reaction received against your action of patting, which was the stimulus, and the dog responded to that stimulus negatively. Therefore, this kind of a situation impacts your behavior, and your behavior towards going near a dog later may be affected. And if such incidents keep on happening repeatedly, then slowly you will develop an automatic response of avoiding going near anything that is negative or anything that creates a fear within you. According to the behaviorist, this association between stimulus and response, what is called the SR connect, results in behavioral changes. And when this behavior change takes place, then we can say that learning has taken place. Behaviorists believe that positive stimuli or rewards create positive associations, while negative stimuli or punishments create a negative behavior associated with that stimuli. According to the behaviorism, the association of positive can also be in the form of rewards, while negative response can be in the form of punishments. And this reward and punishment affects behavior. So, a reward for good behavior supported by continuous repetition, feedback and reinforcement is responsible for bringing about correct behavioral change, whereas punishment will lead to avoidance of a particular behavior and bring about corrections. Such use of reward and punishment behavior such use of reward and punishment results in behavior being sustained. According to behaviorists, there is also continuous repetition, and skill and drill exercises are responsible for leading to a change in behavior. According to them, such experiences enrich learning, and learning brings about permanent change in behavior. Learning is also, according to them, a cause for modification in behavior. So, if we summarize what I have just said, then learning is an acquisition of new behavior. Through this process of conditioning, people learn to either repeat or avoid certain kinds of behavior. Let us now look at some of the major works of behavioralists. Prominent amongst these is Ivan Pavlov, whose theory is classical conditioning. Let us look at some of the major works of behavioralists. These include Ivan Pavlov, whose major theory is that of classical conditioning. Edward Thorndike, whose name is associated with the laws of learning. Watson, who also promulgated the stimulus response theory. Skinner, who built upon the theory of Skinner, whose theory of operant conditioning is also very well known. According to behavioralists, especially Pavlov, behavior change occurs when responses become conditioned and generalized. Behavioralism is therefore expressed in terms of conditioning or conditioning theories of learning. We have Pavlov's classical conditioning theory and Skinner's operant conditioning theory. Let us now concentrate upon Pavlov's conditioning theory. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, who lived from 1849 to 1936, was a Russian physiologist. He won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1904 for his work on digestion. Pavlov, as director of the physiological laboratory at the Institute of Experimental Medicine in Petrograd, received the Nobel Prize, and I am now quoting from the 1904 presentation speech, which said, "Pavlov has demonstrated another aspect of functional association between the gastric mucous membrane and the nervous system." It is via in his 1904 presentation speech, it was said that the Nobel Prize was being given to him in recognition of his work on the physiology of digestion, through which knowledge on vital aspects of the subject has been transformed and enlarged. What exactly did Ivan Petrovich Pavlov study and draw conclusions that have had such a major impact upon educational psychology? Well, Pavlov observed that in his laboratory, dogs salivate at the sight of food. This food and this salivation is a natural response, there is no conditioning. The food is brought, the dog sees it, and there is a saliva which comes in his mouth as an unconditional response, which is called UR. The food which is called unconditional stimulus is referred to as US. US, that is unconditional stimuli, leads to UR, that is food to saliva. Often it was seen that even at the sight of an attendant who brought them food, the salivation would stop. Pavlov's study led to the realization that this salivation was a response due to the stimulus of food, and the attendant who brought it was considered the medium of the salivation. The next thing that Pavlov did in his experiment was that he tried to see the impact on a neutral response, and the next step was that Pavlov began ringing a bell. Normally the ringing of the bell would have no effect on the salivation by the dog. The bell was ringing because it formed a neutral stimuli. A neutral stimuli is that which produces no automatic response on its own. However, what Pavlov did was that he introduced the ringing of the bell, and this was followed by food to the dog. The sight of food made the dog salivate. This bell was followed by food, and this experiment was done many times. The bell rang and the dog received the food. After a number of such repetitions in which the bell rang and was followed by food, it was seen that the mere ringing of the bell alone led to salivation by the dog. This was a new, in this case, the ringing of the bell became the conditional stimulus or the CS, while the salvation at the sound of a bell was the conditioned response. These experiments by Pavlov showed that associating or pairing of a potent stimuli with a neutral response led to a conditioned response. This led to what is called generation, and the conditional response occurs due to stimuli similar to the conditional stimuli. According to Pavlov, in a classical conditioning, a conditioned stimuli leads to conditioned response, and any stimulus that readily leads to response can be paired with a neutral stimuli to change behavior and bring about learning. The principle of conditional response is fundamental to behavior, as it is able to bring about changes in behavior. Behaviorists use the term conditioning to show that learning is taking place. The theory of classical conditioning is used to show how learning can take place. Some of the principles that have emerged due to this classical conditioning theory include the principle of reinforcement. The term reinforcement refers to the following of conditional response by unconditional stimulus. Here in this case, it was food following the bell. Without reinforcing the bell with food, no conditioning could have developed. Food was the reinforcement, and this type of understanding can be applicable to a student's learning also, when students are rewarded immediately, and that is when learning becomes effective. Quite often unconditional stimulus reduces a drive, so the term reinforcement also refers to reduction in the drive or tension. Another important principle was that of sequence or time intervals. It is seen that there is an optimal time when the presentation of a conditioned stimuli and an unconditional stimuli. If there is a variation, that is an increase or a decrease in the time, then there are chances that there may be no conditioning, or the bond or association may not be formed. Similarly, another principle is that of stimulus generalization. If we are conditioned to a particular thing, then we would be conditioned to all things of that kind. In this case, it was a bell, so any kind of sound would be a part of the stimulus generalization. Let us now come to differentiation. It is not necessary that all reactions will be the same. When two stimuli are sufficiently distinguishable, the organism can continue to respond to one of them. Therefore, regularly reinforcing one stimuli and not reinforcing the other will have different effects. As per this classical conditioning, the principle of extinction also has an impact, because if the sound of the bell, as was in this case, is not followed by food, then it implies that there is no reinforcement. At this stage, if this is done continuously, then the dog would stop to secrete saliva. This stage is called extinction. Similarly, there are other principles such as that of spontaneous recovery and principle of inhibition, as well as that of higher order conditioning. All these, including the principle of secondary reinforcement, have an impact upon learning. We will see that these impacts have been used for designing instruction, and for, especially in the case of distance education, where material is designed for diverse learners, these kind of theories have a major impact. If you see the principle of differentiation, then in terms of distance education, where there are diverse learners, you may need to develop different stimuli so that they are able to elicit a response, because as I said earlier, different individuals will respond differently to stimuli, and therefore a variety is required so that you are able to ensure effective learning for these diverse individuals. Even in terms of the principle of sequence and time intervals, it is very important that the instructional designer decides when and what stimuli is to be given, what kind of interval there should be between the stimuli. The concept of pacing and giving materials or other kind of learning resources at different times is based upon the principle of sequence and time intervals. Even in terms of high order conditioning, if you look at Bloom's taxonomy, there also you find that the taxonomy moves from easy to difficult. And here too we find that the sequence of learning tasks needs to move from simple to complex. When this material is being designed, then these kind of principles of moving from simple to complex form a very important part. When we speak of designing assessment strategies, there too the relationship between learning objectives and what is being assessed has to be kept in mind. If we look at Pavlov's principles of extension, then it is very obvious that if there is no stimulus, there is no reinforcement of that stimulus, then there will be a reduction in response and perhaps the response might get extinct. Therefore, as designers, it is important that from time to time reinforcement has to be given, so that extinction does not take place and learning continues. There may also be a need for some sort of secondary reinforcement, and that is why the instructional designer has to keep in mind key learning points which can be used to reinforce important concepts. Guidance, feedback, rewards, motivational points, reflection points, these all act as secondary reinforcement and help in the process of learning and in strengthening learning. And therefore, we see that Pavlov's classical conditioning has many applications that can be useful for instructional design. The entry level behavior of learners can be identified, and accordingly stimulus given depending upon the stage at which these learners are in their educational status. Even in terms of identification of learning objectives, developing objectives which are simple and then moving to complex, description of the learning task so that it is motivating, so that it acts as a stimulus is also important. Designing assessment strategies, ensuring that there is reinforcement, as well as the realization that students need to be able to respond to particular stimulus, and therefore the association between the stimulus and respond has to be created in an innovative way so that it is able to get the attention of the learner. Most importantly, teachers should be able to design materials that motivate their learners to learn. This is important because different strategies will motivate different people. A variety of strategies that are effective need to be taken, and therefore the designing of teaching learning activities has to have innovation, keeping in mind the principles of behavioralism, if this is theory that is being used to deliver or develop the materials. We see that behavioralists have had a major impact on learning and teaching and learning, and the design of curriculum, the design of teaching learning activities, the design of assessment strategies, the delivery modes have all been impacted by the theories put forward by the behavioralists. In conclusion, I would like to say that classical conditioning and the theories of behavioralists have had a major impact upon design of materials and development. Thank you so much for your attention.